Hi, my name is Brian McGowan. I'm an Extension Wildlife Specialist and Coordinator in Forestry and Natural Resources. It's my pleasure to give this program on behalf of the Office of Engagement. I want to talk a little bit about evaluation of programs and impact. And so before we begin, I'd like for you to take a moment, pause, and reflect on when do you achieve societal impact in terms of how do you know once you've gotten to that endpoint. You can kind of imagine different scenarios, right? So you might be working with a community on a health program for disadvantaged youth, and because of the work that you've done, they have increased access to different aspects of healthcare. Some of us might be working with small-scale farmers, and because of the work that you've done, you've helped them with their business and marketing strategies, and as a result of that, they have more access to buyers and increased profitability. Some of us might be working with woodland owners, and you help them with tree planting and management, and a result of that, we have more forest cover and increased capacity for carbon sequestration. So no matter which program that you do, the tool that you're going to use to assess if you've achieved societal impact is going to be evaluation. And evaluation at its simplest term is simply a systematic approach to measuring the merit or worth of some program. And you can think of it both in terms of the end user. Did the program achieve what it wanted to achieve and benefit the end user? Or you could think of it from the aspect of the people putting on the program to those even funding it. So in other words, was it worth our investment to fund this particular program? You might think of evaluation and research in the same context. And there certainly are similarities with both, right? So they both use a systematic data-based approach, and they both use a lot of the same techniques in terms of social science methods, from surveys to interviews to focus groups. But there are differences between the two, right? So research, when you're doing research, you're trying to produce generalizable knowledge, right? And where, as opposed to evaluation, you're looking at the intended users. Another difference is in terms of the approach is theory-based, right? So research, you might have some type of a theory that you're using to test certain questions, where in terms of evaluation, you're looking at the context, right? So people's situations are different, the communities vary among each other, and so you're looking at a very context approach to it. And then lastly, you're really looking at the questions driven by the investigator and the research approach driven by the investigator with in terms of research, whereas opposed to evaluation, it's really user-driven, right? You're doing a program to some benefit of the end user. And then the questions are really depend on the program itself, but also the funding agencies involved. So many of us work in communities that have a variety of different users and stakeholder groups, right? And so how do we approach that in terms of an evaluation approach? So Chasden and Payne suggested the evaluation of public value, or EPV approach, as a framework for approaching evaluation in these communities. And it has different components. The first they termed as publicness. And so if you think about it as a program, you're deciding which users you're serving, right? And so from an evaluation approach, you need to ask, are you inclusive in terms of who needs to be there? Who are the affected users? The same can be true of the people involved in delivering the program. Do you have the right stakeholders and partners that are helping you push this program through that community? The second part of that is organizational credibility, right? And so you can think of organizational credibility in terms of capacity. Are they able to actually deliver and produce the program and achieve the results that you want to achieve? But then also a lot of it is in terms of, are they trustworthy? Are they responsive to the community needs? And so that's an important aspect of it as well. The third part to this EPV approach is program outcomes. And so these are things typically you think of about program and evaluation in terms of you do a program and what resulted from that program, right? And so a lot of times these are termed in terms of the SMART criteria. So these are goals that are specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're relevant, and then they're time constrained, so they have a time component to them. So the last aspect of this is this broader impacts. And so these bring all these things together to really assess what the benefits are for society. And so they propose using the 7 community capitals framework, which includes cultural, human, social, political, financial, built, and natural capitals. And so the idea is that any community can be linked to the presence and strength of these 7 different capitals. And ultimately, as you tap into these resources and invest in them, you're going to really promote the long-term sustainability of these communities. So when you first went through your logic model, you probably had some iterations there in terms of really identifying what your target audience is, what the issue is, and how your activities are going to lead to specific outcomes, right? And so this was really presented in a linear format. However, you can also think of it in terms of a circular format because there's a lot of reiteration going on here. So in other words, as you start thinking about how you're going to evaluate aspects of your program, that's ultimately going to also change perhaps how you define what your outcomes are and what your program goals are. And so you can really think of it in terms of relevance and measurability oftentimes. So in other words, a lot of times we want a particular outcome, but we can't really identify a way to accurately measure it or understand of its relevance in terms of the target audience. And so you have to change the outcomes. And so in this way, this is how evaluation and doing logic model planning are really linked together. So the idea is when you're doing these evaluations, you have to identify indicators. What are the benchmarks that are going to show that, yes, we're making progress towards the things that we want to achieve, and ultimately that societal impact. And so that's really the key, or one of the keys certainly in evaluation, right? And in many ways, you can think of things in terms of direct and indirect observations or assessments, right? And so you can say you're working on a program with farmers and the ultimate goal is you want them to improve stream quality because of runoff, okay? And so you're focusing on things like buffer strips and conservation cover and those types of things. And so from a conditional standpoint, you might think about, is what you achieved actually benefited water quality in the area, right? So you'd actually have to measure and look at aspects of biological things you would measure in terms of water quality. The other parts of that, though, is you can ask them about changes. So do they perceive any changes in terms of environmental health improvements on their farm or with the stream, okay? And so that's more of an indirect approach. You can do the same thing with behaviors, right? And so you can actually go out and directly observe, did they put in buffer strips? How accurately did they put them in? Are those maintained over time? So that's another aspect of these types of things. Or you can also simply ask them to self-report in terms of, yes or no, if they installed buffer strips, and maybe ask them to assess acreage and things like that, right? And so your decision on whether to do these is going to be based on that SMART criteria in a way, right? And so really trying to directly observe some of these things may not be realistic because of the geographic scope or the time frame that you're limited to. And so because of that, you have to go through and do the self-reporting. Conversely, though, you can also think of it depending on what the practice is. And so some things that on a land management scale, which is what I deal with, they're very complex. And so you may not get accurate results if you simply rely on self-reporting. And then lastly, in terms of changes in knowledge or aspiration or skill or awareness, you can directly measure knowledge, right? So you can give them a test and do some type of an intervention or program, and then retest them afterwards and really see if there's truly is a change in knowledge, right? Okay, but obviously that has limitations because that's very short-term in nature. Or you can simply ask them to self-report that, right? So before the program, how would you rate your knowledge on this subject? And then now, how would you rate it, okay? And so there's different ways of going off there. Typically though, what you're going to encounter though is there's always going to be trade-offs, right? And so you think about those SMART criteria and you've got to think about trade-offs in terms of what you might want to do and what realistically you really can do. So how do we put this into practice in terms of program development and evaluation, okay? And so I would argue that you really have to have an understanding of where you want to go. What are your goals? What are your objectives? What do you want to achieve from an outcome standpoint? And that's really going to help you determine your evaluation strategy. So in a previous program, you worked on a logic model. And in that logic model, you have an issue, target audience, activities, and outcomes, okay? So now I want you to pause for a moment and get that logic model out and review those outcomes and see if you can identify one or more indicators that would measure progress towards each of those outcomes. So by now you have a good idea what a logic model looks like. This is a very simplified logic model that just has the boxes of the types of things that you want to fill within a model, but it also kind of covers what the evaluation is going to be. And so in my line of work, I've done a lot of work with woodland owners. It's a big issue in Indiana. Woodlands provide societal benefits in terms of clean air, wildlife habitat, and many other benefits, but they also are mostly privately owned. And so to have an impact on the resource, we have to work with woodland owners. And so we have to understand when we're developing programs what our evaluation is going to be. And really we want to start with that needs approach. What are their needs? And so there's different ways that we can approach that for woodland owners. There's actually a national woodland owner survey that actually asks woodland owners in terms of what issues they face and what are their major concerns. Sometimes some of that information is available in peer-reviewed literature. And so we can look at studies on woodland owners in terms of what are barriers that they have to doing certain practices on their property. And then lastly, an important part of what we do in extension is communication. So we'll communicate with audience groups and different programs and venues and things like that. And we get a good idea in terms of what kind of things that they're facing in terms of issues, barriers that they face. But then also we can talk with people who serve them. So in terms of professional foresters and other advisors who work with woodland owners on a variety of different things. And so combining all those different information sources, we get a good picture of what some of the issues are and what some of the barriers that they face. And so then we can use that to develop some type of a project, right? And so we have different ways that we work with woodland owners on education of different things. And then eventually we want to look at what the outcomes are. So with woodland owners, we look at certainly increased knowledge in terms of different types of woodland management practices. Certainly an increased awareness of professional sources and what planning is, but ultimately the behavior that we're looking at is in terms of them seeking professional advice and also doing planning, because different property owners are going to have different things going on in terms of resources that they have, issues that they face, but ultimately we want them to make informed decisions, right? And so that's really done with professionals and also done with planning. So if we link them up with those two things, no matter what issues that they face moving forward, they're going to have some kind of a guidance, okay? Because especially with woodland management, if you make uninformed decisions, that can result into things that result in environmental issues and also financial issues. And these things really take a long time to kind of fix themselves. And then ultimately, as a result of that, the management of woodlands meets long-term objectives and they're directed under a plan, okay? And so from a valuation piece, you can think of it. So if we're looking at that impact, we might want to do some type of a survey with woodlands and woodland owners that attended our programs and find out how many of them have modified or developed a plan because of that. How do they use the plan? You know, those types of things. Maybe we ask them to a number of acres that are directed under that plan. And those are indicators that kind of lead us to this conclusion here. The last part about this that you notice is that process evaluation. And so typically we think of the process evaluation in terms of the program, right? What do they think of the program? What do they think of the instructor, the format? Was the information presented at the right type of level? Was the pace of instruction important? You know, all those types of things, right? But if you notice by this model, that process evaluation really extends the whole life of the program. So when we're doing our needs assessment, when we're thinking about measuring outcomes and impact, we need to evaluate our strategies for that through the life of the program, and we may have to make adjustments for that because things change. The context can change. And so that's a really important aspect of evaluation that a lot of people miss, right? We do our needs assessment. We ask them what they thought about the workshop. We follow up with them a little bit later, determine how they use that information. But a lot of times the piece that's missing is that process evaluation throughout the life of the program. So with any type of a venture, there's always pitfalls and things that can happen, right? And that's certainly true of evaluation. So first, you can think of invalid assumptions. And so a lot of times with programs, we work with a subset of the audience that we're really trying to reach. And so you might want to extrapolate the type of information that you obtain from that program to other users. And so that may be valid or it may be invalid. And so you have an understanding of who those program participants are and how they reflect the larger population is important. Sometimes we might use the wrong evaluation method. So for example, with surveys are used quite a bit. They're very powerful, so you can sample large populations with it, and you can summarize a lot of data very effectively, right? But the problem is they can be expensive, okay? And they can oversimplify and limit responses. So in other words, you may misidentify what the issue is or ways to approach the issue, and your survey doesn't have the things that they are really important to them. So it limits choice. The other thing is really simplifying things. So in terms of land management and woodland management, there's a lot of things that go into decisions that they make, right? And so someone can have a sudden financial crisis that leads them to do certain things or maybe avoid certain things. Maybe it's the importance of family in their woodlands, and that's what drives a lot of the things. And so if you don't include those kinds of things in your evaluation, you're going to miss that piece. There's also bias, obviously, right? Any method that we use, there's going to be bias, right? People are naturally biased creatures, I guess you can say. But think about it. So if you're asking people to evaluate a program, say, for example, the 8-week woodland owner course that we do in our department, so you're building a relationship with the woodland owners over an 8-week period, and then at the conclusion, you're asking them to evaluate the instructors and evaluate whether they learned something or not. And so there's going to be some level of bias there because you've just developed a relationship with them and some level of trust. And now maybe they don't want to truly say what they think because they don't want to offend this person now who they know. Another thing is time frame. And so with some things, there's going to be a lag period involved. And so if you're evaluating a program or you're working in an area that basically the things that they do as a result of that are very long-term type decisions, things like healthcare and natural resources management certainly come into mind. There's going to be issues there in terms of recall. There's going to be issues there in terms of attributing what they're doing to that original program, that intervention. And so there's definitely going to be pitfalls with that. And then lastly, sometimes with programs, we have competing interests. And so healthcare is a good example of this. You might have different groups involved in a particular program, and one group is really focused on treatment, and another group is really focused on prevention, okay? One is not more right than the other. They both have their strengths and reasons for doing it, but sometimes those conflicting interests can really affect the evaluation of a program. As I close up here, I do want to point to a couple different resources. So in Extension, we've used evaluation for a lot of different things in our programs. It's really important in what we do. There's a couple good websites I'd like to point you to. One is done by the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension, and another one with the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station. Both of these sites have really good resources, not only on program evaluation, but all sorts of aspects of program development and planning and things like that. Some of us who are more interested in books, these are a couple books that I use. The first one there, 4 Levels of Training Evaluation, is a good summary. It's a good read. I would classify it as an easy read, so it's a good book to have if you're going to do any type of evaluation. Utilization-focused evaluation is more of a reference. It's more of a more challenging read, I guess you can think of it from that standpoint, but it still has a lot of good information there as well. And then lastly, I want to point you to the Office of Engagement. Certainly this video series, but they've got a lot of different resources in terms of workshops and other professional development programs of interest for people who do work with community and community engagement. Thank you.